Today on Life After Lockdown, we're looking at how green the recovery from the pandemic will be. When the world first locked down, there were many claims that nature and the environment was being given time to heal. We saw clear waters in what had been polluted harbours, as well as a drop in road and air traffic. But will this continue as the world and the economy begins to recover? And just how green are those stimulus packages? A study from the Oxford Smith School examined hundreds of packages and policies around the world. It found that just 4% of policies are considered green, with the potential to reduce greenhouse in the long term, while 92% would simply maintain the pre-pandemic status quo. Germany agreed a €130 billion stimulus package with financial incentives for electric and hybrid vehicles, while the EU unveiled what it called a green stimulus with €750 billion pledged to aid a green recovery. But billions has been spent around the world to rescue the flight industry. And there are fears that as the recession starts, investment in traditional industries will lead to a rise in carbon emissions. Well, let's bring in Brian O'Callaghan in Oxford, one of the co-authors of the study. Also joining us from Boston is Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University, Rachel Kyte. She's a former special representative of the UN Secretary General and the former World Bank Group Vice President and Special Envoy for Climate Change. And Kim DeRidder, the Director of Environment Programs at the Asia Foundation in Bangkok. Thank you all for joining us here on the programme. Brian, I'll begin with you because you have been looking at this particular study as well as stimulus packages. The UK today announced a £3 billion green package as part of its coronavirus stimulus. Do you think these packages go far enough?
Yeah, it's great to be with you. Look, it's a good start, but it is still lacking. Look, let's compare $3 billion in the UK on green retrofits to $36 billion in Germany or $13.5 billion, these are all adjusted to pounds, in France. What Germany is spending on hydrogen alone, $9 billion, is 3 times what has come out this morning in the UK. Of course, we probably should take it a little bit easy on the UK side. We know that this isn't the extent of the full stimulus packages, and there's more to come. And so if Prime Minister Johnson is serious about comparing himself to Franklin D. Roosevelt and developing a real New Deal, there's a lot still to come. So let's look forward to that.
I mean, what's extraordinary is that there has been all of this talk about resetting, restarting the way in which we function. But according to this study, 92% of countries, governments and companies will maintain the status quo.
Yeah, so that figure was referring to the rescue type spending that we've seen so far. Generally, when it comes to recessionary spending on the part of the government, we divide it into rescue type and recovery type. Rescue type spending is necessarily for keeping people and businesses alive. It's completely unsurprising that that type of spending goes towards healthcare, unemployment benefits, etc. And as a result, we wouldn't really expect it to either be green or dirty in nature. What we're really focused on is this recovery type spending, and that's where the opportunity lies. Governments at this point in time, as many of them look forward to this recovery type spending, have a binary choice ahead, really. They can either choose to support the dirty, in some ways failing industries of the past, ones that have served us well, but whose time have come up, or they can look to the future, invest in green technologies that both provide short-term economic stimulus and provide long-term job opportunities and really long-term prosperity.
I'm just going to bring in Rachel. Rachel, let's just look at the view from the United States. I mean, do you have concerns that President Trump will try and maintain the status quo as far as green energy is concerned? Because he's backpedaled a lot on the Obama policies and may use this pandemic as an excuse to do that.
Well, yeah, just picking up where Brian left off, we've had the relief stage, and I think the relief stage is continuing as in many countries as the depth and length of the virus's impact is being properly understood. And so now the preparation for recovery. And so there is an opportunity in the United States, and particularly by governors at the state level, to stimulate sort of shovel-ready jobs in clean infrastructure. That would be renewable energy infrastructure, maybe the kind of things that you've started to see in the UK. So jobs in terms of land restoration, coastal defences, etc. So the opportunities do exist. That's not the message coming out of Washington. And I think it's also interesting to look at, the energy economy here. Obviously, there's always a focus on sort of the 50,000 jobs that remain in the coal economy, but we've been losing jobs in the renewable energy sector in the last few months, and that's where you could see an important stimulus to get those jobs back for what will be a very important part of the energy economy going forward, and that's essential for US competitiveness.
I mean, you've said the opportunities are there, but in many instances, in a crisis like this, in the past, when you look at history, people revert to what they know and what they feel comfortable with. Is it likely that in this case, these governors and on a federal level, these opportunities will be taken?
Well, I think we're looking at we're looking at a congressional debate around what an infrastructure part of the recovery would be. I think it's very clear that there are more jobs in the renewable energy industry. There are more jobs in retrofitting buildings and making them energy efficient than there are in the sort of heavy carbon old energy economy. And what's interesting is that all of the advice, I mean, the Smith School report is very important, but the advice from the International Energy Agency, which the US does listen to, and the IMF, it is very clear that there are things that you can do now which will be job rich, which will get small businesses up and running again, and which will put you on a path to a cleaner recovery. And those include energy efficiency in buildings. They include, investing in the new technologies for the medium term as well. So what's really quite surprising about this discussion around recovery, as opposed to previous economic disruptions, is that there's a violent agreement about what can be done. Question will be, will Congress follow that?
Follow that through. Let's bring in Kim and have a look at the situation in Asia, because countries like South Korea are really doing quite well when you look at them in comparison to other countries. Just give us a sense of how it's doing.
South Korea, thank you very much for having me. South Korea is one of the few post-COVID stimulus packages that is in place and is arguably the greenest in the region. It's even calling itself the Green New Deal. It aims to update much of Korea's building and manufacturing infrastructure for renewables and energy efficiency over the next 3 years. The overall package is really quite large. It's 25 billion, which is significant for South Korea. It's really interesting to contrast that with, say, Japan, where they have put up $2.1 trillion for their post-COVID stimulus package, where less than 1% is going to green initiatives, at least as far as we've seen.
What about countries like India? Because, we've done many pieces here on the BBC, and I've spoken to many colleagues who have said, finally, we can see the sky in Delhi and things have really changed. Is the government there taking it seriously?
Well, it's India's in a very unique situation. They do have a very significant stimulus package that they've just released. $264 billion. And we know that it's targeting 7 sectors, including education, health reform, banking, business development. But we've only seen the broad strokes of the plan, so it's hard to know just how green the package is. We also know that India has relaxed environmental protection during this period to boost economic recovery. And India has also just privatized its coal mining sector in order to increase production and reduce imports. So that's not encouraging, especially considering that India's coal is rather dirty compared to its imported coal. But that said, India, as well as China, you have strong proponents in government, academia, and civil society that are pushing to incorporate green growth elements into the stimulus plans. And so I would say in both China and India, both are still a work in progress, and both are yet subject to change.
I'll just bring in actually Rachel to discuss China. You've mentioned there, Kim, China. Rachel, give us an idea of China and how it's dealing with this green recovery, or even if it's kind of dealing with it, especially when it comes to massive projects and initiatives like the Belt and Road.
Well, I think domestically there's a tussle within the Chinese leadership about, where in the regions of China, the traditional response to an economic downturn is to throw up a lot of infrastructure. So that would traditionally be coal-fired power plants. But that doesn't fit with the way China wishes to evolve its energy infrastructure and its need to curb its emissions. And so the question will be, will the plans which exist, will those plants get built? Will they actually then operate if they are built? And is that a next generation of white elephants in an economy which has to be cleaner? For the Belt and Road, we've seen China, engage in extraordinary amounts of investment in infrastructure. Most African countries are more indebted to China than they are to the international financial institutions. And that infrastructure has been largely not green. So there is an opportunity for China, as it emerges as a global economic leader, to be driving that in a green way. At the moment, the Belt and Road initiatives are sitting there. The contractors who build these things are not on the ground in Africa building at the moment. They haven't really come back since everybody went home for the Chinese New Year. And you've got a situation where you've got aid, sort of COVID aid flying into these countries from China. So I think that how China shows up internationally as an economic leader post-COVID will be essential to the green recovery.
Into the green recovery. I'm just going to bring in Brian, because Brian, you talked about rescue, not recovery. And we often look at the EU as leaders when it comes to green recovery. But certainly in the era of coronavirus, they spent massive amounts bailing out airlines like Air France and Lufthansa, and that hasn't been green, and that isn't. So that's sort of adding to the emissions on the planet.
Yeah, that's right. So when we speak about airline recoveries generally, the message is a little bit mixed across the continent. Overall, our perspective on dirty type bailouts is that taxpayers are losing out. When we ran the survey internationally, airline bailouts, unconditional airline bailouts, performed the most poorly in terms of economic multiplier, in terms of speed, and in terms of environmental impact. And so the question is, why on earth are we supporting these types of policies? Of course, there are other national interest type positions that are important to support with these policies. And so we as taxpayers need to be asking, well, what is the quid pro quo? And our perspective is it's important to green those policies, tie in green conditions so that the future of that industry, which will be difficult to mitigate carbon emissions, the future of that industry is more positive.